welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple housekeeping elements right up top. I wanted to point out the chat feature, so feel free to utilize that during the presentation to ask any questions as they occur to you. There'll be plenty of time at the end of us for answering questions that may have come up that we didn't get to during the presentation. Additionally, this will be recorded and we'll be sending it to all of those who registered for today's webinar. And with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Emily Hamilton. I am the Innovation Advocate and Deal Flow Analyst for the Cleveland Water Alliance. I'm here with Greg Lewis from LightDeck, and I'm very excited to introduce another one of CWA's Innovator Showcase Series. If you're not familiar with CWA, we are an economic development nonprofit located in Cleveland, Ohio. And as you can see here on the slide, these are some of the different programs that CWA is currently working on. This series is intended to be a front row look at different organizations, large and small, that are innovating in the water industry. And some of these companies have come to us through our various programs, the primary of which is our Lake Erie Watershed Testbed for IoT. I want to pause on this program for just a moment and explain it a little bit further. So for a touch of background on our water technology testbed is that it's focused on supporting innovators and technologies intended to be deployed in the natural environment. So that can include streams, ponds, open water conditions, and we are focused obviously on freshwater environments here in the Great Lakes region. So in order to support the trialing and or demonstrating of IoT technologies, we've built a telecommunications network to enable that deployment. So what you're looking at here is a map of Lake Erie as it has appeared throughout all of history, essentially, as unconnected. And what you see here is the coverage that we've established today through the deployment of telecommunications gateways. Through the help of our tower climbers, as you can see to the left of the map. And this work is ongoing. We're continuing to deploy additional gateways to provide robust coverage across Lake Erie. This work has also enabled us to deploy our own devices to track real-time things like weather conditions and various water properties, and then therefore provide a benchmark of data for the newer technologies deploying within the testbed. I'd also like to add that the testbed supports technologies that cover the entirety of the IoT lifecycle. So that includes things like sensors, automation, cybersecurity, and so on. Now, I want to tie in another valuable facet of CWA's programming, which is our Lake Erie Volunteer Science Network. CWA has been working to build a regional community of practice that amplifies existing volunteer monitoring efforts in the region and creates new opportunities for collective impact by helping local programs standardize their efforts, share the best practices, and collaborate across jurisdictions. The work that has been put into the infrastructure of the Lake Erie Volunteer Science Network has provided an additional opportunity for the trialing and demonstrating of innovative technologies in sensing and monitoring applications, and therefore has expanded the capacity of our testbed that we were talking about in the previous slide. But in this case, it engages with community members rather than engineers or professional scientists. This adds a different and, in our point of view, valuable element to these demonstrations. We were able to leverage members of the LEVSN for a technology piloting opportunity. This is where LightDeck's harmful algal bloom toxin monitoring technology comes in. And through a broader NOAA-funded pilot, 4 members of the Lake Erie Volunteer Science Network were engaged for training and the provision of feedback. In today's showcase, we'll be hearing from Greg Lewis of LightDeck, as I previously mentioned, and he's providing us with an exciting look at the technology they've been testing with the help of our volunteer scientists. And at the end of his presentation, I'll have some questions for Greg about that experience. So it is my great pleasure to hand the reins on over to him.
Thank you very much, Emily. Hold on, let me get my slides up here. All right, as Emily mentioned, my name is Greg Lewis from LightDeck Diagnostics, and I'll be giving you an overview of some of the technology that LightDeck has been developing and piloting in the Lake Erie region and the Great Lakes regions, as well as an overview of the company as a whole. The first thing I want to do is highlight that this is an extremely collaborative effort. As you can see, we work with a large number of researchers in the Great Lakes region, both with the Cleveland Water Alliance, as well as researchers at private institutes and universities in the area. So none of this research and none of this work would be possible without all of our collaborators. So a quick overview about who LightDeck is as a company. We're a diagnostics first company, but we really have 3 branches of the company that we focus on. The first one being our assay development. And within our assay development, we do environmental testing technologies like what we'll be talking about today. But we also have additional branches in human diagnostics as well as veterinary diagnostics that are largely driven by our partnerships with Heska Corporation, the Henry Jackson Foundation, and BARDA through the US military. In addition to our actual assay development, these assays require readers that allow us to perform these tests. And those readers some of those readers are shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. And those are developed by our engineering teams who develop these, as well as the necessary accessories, batteries, touch screens, et cetera, that allow for these assays to become usable in a large range of environments, from field testing to point of care settings in a doctor's office or a veterinarian's office. And finally, the third and probably the largest growing portion of the LightDeck company is our actual cartridge manufacturing. And that's what allows us to scale these tests so that they are usable in so many different environments. And we work very closely with our manufacturing teams for process development. But I think some of the most exciting news in that side of things is the fact that we have a $35 million facility that is nearing completion, going up in Longmont, so about 45 minutes away from our current headquarters. And that is going to be allowing us to significantly increase our production capacity to reaching over 1 million cartridges per month. So that's about 20x improvement in our current capacity for our facility as of now. So as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing today on our environmental testing team. And I do want to highlight my team that has been doing a lot of this work. I don't really get into the lab all that much anymore. So much of the research has been performed by our 2 RAs, Cassandra Petro and Brooks McDonald, as well as a water technician, Anna Melvin, who recently joined our team earlier this summer. So jumping into this, cyanotoxins and why monitoring is essential. So I think a lot of us here are very aware of cyanotoxins, particularly in the Great Lakes region, and why it's very important to keep monitoring them, especially when we're looking at drinking water and recreational use. But as we're pretty well aware, these cyanotoxins are increasing over time. And a lot of this is due to increased temperatures in lakes and rivers, nutrient runoff from agriculture, but all of these different causes are leading to increased cyanotoxin blooms, larger amounts of toxins in the water and potentially hazardous issues, potentially hazardous situations, such as the Toledo shutdown from several years ago. The two most prevalent cyanotoxins that we're concerned about are microcystin, which is the most prevalent freshwater toxin that's found throughout the United States, and is shown here on this map. All of these colored dots on the map are locations where microcystin was detected. And you can see this is ubiquitous across the entire country. It's not just localized to any particular region, but this is the most prevalent. The second one that is one that really wasn't that big of an issue in the United States up until the past 10 years or so is cylindrospermopsin. And this has been increasing in prevalence both globally as well as in the United States. And similarly, both of these toxins can cause fever, headache, vomiting, and they're produced by a large number of algal species. But again, cylindrospermopsin is not nearly as common as the microcystins, but these are both becoming more and more of a problem throughout the country. And if we're thinking about these being grown by these harmful algae blooms, why is it that we can't just see the bloom and assume that it's toxic? I mean, you look at the picture on the right, and these algal blooms are very noticeable. It's pretty clear when they're present or not. And that comes down to the fact that not every algal bloom will actually produce these toxins. And there's a lot of factors that go into whether or not these blooms produce any toxins or not. And that's something that's still not very well understood. There's a lot of researchers in the Great Lakes regions that are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what causes these blooms to become toxic, what indicates how toxic they will be, and when that peak of toxicity will be. And in fact, oftentimes what we see is that it's actually after the bloom has died off and the toxins are released from the algae that we actually see the highest levels of toxins occurring. So even when the water looks clear after a bloom has receded, that may be when the toxins are at their most prevalent and highest levels. So it's very important to make sure that we're monitoring throughout the life cycle of these algae to make sure that we understood when and how toxic the water has become. And as we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, more and more regions and toxins are showing up in the United States. For example, cylindrospermopsin used to be very rare in the United States, but it's becoming more and more common. And one of the side effects of that is that in regions where historically cylindrospermopsin was not an issue, as that starts becoming more and more prevalent, those locations may not currently be testing for cylindrospermopsin. And when they do start seeing cases of cylindrospermopsin appearing, that's something that they may be slow to detect because that's not in their standard testing plan. So we find it really important to monitor for multiple types of toxins, even when we don't expect to see those toxins, because we want to make sure that we're getting out ahead of any of these issues and not letting them creep up and surprise us. And so just kind of highlighting again the prevalence and the issues associated with harmful algal blooms. Here's just a smattering of headlines that have been pulled regarding algal blooms. There's a 600% increase in algal blooms between 2010 and 2020. There's a huge amount of money being spent by states in the Great Lakes regions, as well as across the country, looking at the Gulf Coast on algal blooms and treatment of these algal blooms. So this is an increasing issue, and it's only becoming more and more prevalent. And that's where LightDeck's technology comes in, allowing us to perform a lot of these lab quality tests very rapidly. So just to kind of highlight a big top-down picture overview of the LightDeck technology, we're generating lab quality results in approximately 10 minutes from sample introduction into the instrument. The actual performing of these tests is extremely easy. In a couple of slides, I'll walk you through what an actual sampling protocol looks like. And these tests are very low cost relative to the actual lab testing. They're approximately $30 per cartridge for testing. But really the biggest selling point for these tests is actually the fact that we're able to multiplex these tests. So one single cartridge is able to detect currently 2 of the toxins, microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. And as we'll touch on a little bit later, we're actually expanding that and leveraging this multiplexing technology to increase that to 3 and potentially even 4 toxins in a single cartridge test. So the LightDeck technology relies on using this instrument that's shown right here on the right-hand side. These are really small instruments. They weigh about 5–10 pounds. They're very portable and easy to use. And it's an automated fluorescence-based analysis using a laser excitation of the cartridge. And it provides results in 10 minutes simultaneously for microcystin as well as cylindrospermopsin. And currently, we expect to be able to run over 10,000 tests on a single instrument. So these provide us low-cost tests with quantitative, not qualitative results. So we are actually getting a quantitative measurement of the toxin for each of these 2 toxins. And these test results are stored digitally, so we're not seeing any fading or degradation of the results over time. And looking at how this works, this is based off of a planar waveguide technology that was patented by LightDeck Diagnostics. And shown here on the right-hand side, let's see if I can get a pointer here. Shown here on the right-hand side is just a little schematic of how this technology works. So the laser from the instrument is shown into the bottom of this cartridge right here, into this coupling lens. And that causes it to bounce down this waveguide right here, generating an evanescent field. And that evanescent field allows us to actually fluoresce a fluorophore that is bound to detection molecules specific for the microcystin and the cylindrospermopsin. In addition to that, we include a couple control features on the cartridge in order to make sure we're getting good fidelity and we're making sure that we're not getting any sort of errors with the result. But by developing this assay in such a way that we can print conjugates towards microcystin and cylindrospermopsin directly onto the cartridge, we're able to, with very high specificity, detect 2 different toxins simultaneously. And in fact, we've developed a cartridge that's currently in a pilot program with Cleveland Water Alliance, where we've added a 3rd toxin, saxitoxin, which I'll be touching on in a little bit, all within that same footprint of the cartridge. So we're not really changing anything to the user input, but we're adding an additional toxin to that cartridge very easily. Now, using these tests is very straightforward. In your test kit, you're provided with a tube containing a dried detection reagent, as well as the actual cartridge. So taking a fixed volume pipetter that comes with the instrument, you just add 100 microliters of your sample to that dried reagent pellet and mix that thoroughly. Once that dried reagent is thoroughly dissolved, it gets added into the inlet port of the cartridge. The cartridge gets inserted into the instrument. You select the necessary steps on the software in terms of naming your tests, selecting the correct test type, inputting information as to when the sample was collected, etc. You hit go, and 10 minutes later, you get your results. The instrument will automatically take over and perform the rest of the test, all the testing and the automation necessary. So it's very straightforward and can really be done and processed in about 4 steps from start to finish by the user. And so, as I mentioned, we currently have commercially available our freshwater detection kit for microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. We do have a wide variety of research programs, and I'll touch on these a little bit later in some of the Q&A if necessary. But we're currently working on validating our duplex microcystin and cylindrospermopsin test. We have a pilot program ongoing looking at the addition of saxitoxin. And then in the future, we're looking to add a 4th freshwater toxin of anatoxin A, as well as doing some testing related to shellfish toxins in both shellfish as well as saltwater. And we have some programs related to species identification for algae as well. So just highlighting the freshwater programs that we've had ongoing with Cleveland Water Alliance. Back in summer of 2021, we launched our first pilot program with Cleveland Water Alliance, looking at our commercially available microcystin and cylindrous spermopsin duplex test. And this test was really focused on the usability of our duplex test. And in this case, we worked really closely with the Volunteer Science Network in Lake Erie. So specifically the Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper, Cleveland and Toledo Metro Parks, as well as SUNY Fredonia. And we went through this trying to really get user feedback as to the usability of the assay, whether or not there's any features that these users found very helpful or needed additional testing on, or if there was anything that they found would be beneficial to the overall system. And for this, we provided technical support and troubleshooting via phone, email, as well as an online virtual training as to how to actually use the LightDeck system. But from there, these groups went out into the field and actually collected samples. And you can see they were collecting between 20 and almost 50 samples over the course of the summer. And they went through and they analyzed them to, again, give us feedback as to how this overall system was working. And so out of 152 samples they tested, we got a lot of really good feedback. Primarily, the sample preparation was very minimal. The actual rapid time to result, getting those results in 10 minutes was extremely promising. Everybody said that it was very easy to use and the instructions were quite user-friendly. There were two things that were definitely highlighted as cons for this overall system. And that's the field portability. Currently, the system does have to be tethered to an outlet, so there's no battery in the instrument currently. But that is something that we are actively developing at LightDeck, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get that into the field within the next 2 years or so. The other thing was, in order to actually process the samples, they had to go through an EPA recommended method of freeze thaw, which is a very lengthy process. That's not unique to our LightDeck system. That's actually the lysing process that's necessary for measurement of all toxin or all freshwater samples for microcystin and cylindrous spermopsin. And so we've actively been trying to take this feedback and use it to improve the LightDeck system. So as I mentioned, we're currently developing a portable battery pack. In fact, I have a prototype of it right here on my desk that we're trying to get that working. And we've hopefully are receiving some grant money soon in order to continue improving that. But in addition to that, LightDeck has been developing a portable lysing system that would perform the actual cell lysis in about 10 minutes, significantly cutting down the amount of time necessary from the freeze-thaw cycling. In addition to the actual usability feedback that we received from the Lake Erie Volunteer Science Network, we also work very closely with a group of collaborators and academic institutes as part of a NOAA MERHAB grant in order to demonstrate the actual performance of this assay in the field. And working with researchers at Ohio State University, University of Toledo, University of Michigan, and other members of SIGLR, we started seeing really good, promising results when we compare the results of gold standard approved ELISA testing for microcystin against our assay, again, using the LightDeck system. We do see a little bit of variability when we get to these higher concentrations, but this data is currently in review as we go ahead and prepare a manuscript that will hopefully be published in 2022. Dr. Justin Chaffin at OSU is leading the way on this manuscript. But once we finished up all of that work in summer 2021 with Cleveland Water Alliance, we were really interested in moving ahead with a second pilot study, and that's currently ongoing this summer. And we had a couple options as to where we could go with this second pilot. The first would be to continue looking at usability and performance of our duplex test. but we had actually reached the development stage of our triplex test where we added saxitoxin to that test. That we went ahead and we wanted to see how this updated version of the test with 3 toxins would perform in the field and in the hands of these volunteer scientists. So as I mentioned before, we have funding to expand our freshwater algal detection system to include saxitoxin as well as anatoxin A. Saxitoxin is currently in development, and we're expecting to commercially launch in 2023. So why are we so interested in adding saxitoxin? Saxitoxins are found in both freshwater and saltwater, and it's referred to as paralytic shellfish poisoning or paralytic shellfish toxin because it can cause paralysis, even death, and is actually classified as a chemical weapon. Currently, there's no methods for measuring saxitoxin quantitatively in the field. There are some dipsticks that can be used or ELISAs in order to quantify, but gold standard methodology relies on either using an ELISA or LCMS, which is very expensive, very time consuming, and can take several days to get results. So using our PCM-HAB funding, we've expanded this test panel from the Microcystin and Cylindro to include saxitoxin. And again, we're anticipating the inclusion of anatoxin in 2024. Because we do have all of those multiplexing capabilities, we're expecting there's no difference in the actual sample processing or time to results. So it's still 10 minutes from sample addition to results in order to get now results on 3 separate toxins simultaneously. So this summer in our pilot with Cleveland Water Alliance, we're working with those same groups out of the Lake Erie Volunteer Science Network. In addition, we have support from Bowling Green State University. They've been collaborating very closely with us on the development of this triplex assay, and they'll be helping out this summer as well. So we performed a virtual training workshop on the LightDeck system, as well as these new cartridges. And we're anticipating getting results through the fall and winter and seeing both the usability of this new assay, but also seeing how these results end up looking relative to current gold standard testing. In addition to the work we're doing with the Cleveland Water Alliance, we also have additional field testing being carried out by BGSU, SUNY ESF, and OSU. They're collecting samples for us from the Great Lakes region and providing us with additional feedback. So the key takeaways I really want to highlight are that more toxins are being found in more places, and often it's toxins we were not expecting to see in those places. So testing early and quickly is going to allow us to monitor and track the rise of these toxins and identify what is leading to these toxins being found in all of these new locations. And by monitoring for multiple types of toxins, it makes it harder for us to be surprised when these new toxins show up in places that they're unexpected. And lastly, getting faster data means that we're able to get a faster response to all of these harmful algae blooms. And the sooner we get these results, the sooner the key decision makers can come up with what's necessary, whether it's shutting down a lake or starting a treatment process, or even just notifying officials that something may need to be happening in the future. The sooner we have that information, the sooner these decisions can be made. So in conclusion, LightDeck has a fully developed, rapid, low-cost, multiplex cyanotoxin detection system. Currently, it's a duplex microcystin and cylinders spermopsin, but as I mentioned, we're hoping in 2023 to be launching the triplex, and in 2024, launching a fourplex. And from the once you've completed lysis of your sample, the actual detection of these toxins takes place in 10 minutes. And we also look at fields beyond freshwater, including saltwater and in the shellfish fields. So with that, I would like to thank all of our various collaborators and funding agencies. There's too many to mention all at once, but specifically our collaborators at BGSU, SUNY ESF, and NOAA. They've been extremely helpful on this expansion into triplex, as well as the various funding agencies that are paying for this work. And additionally, I do want to highlight the other ongoing programs at LightDeck Diagnostics, including our veterinary programs that are funded by Heska Corporation, and our human IVD programs that are funded by BARDA and Henry Jackson Foundation. So with that, thank you. My email is here if anybody has any additional questions that we don't get a chance to get to in today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Greg, for sharing all of that information with us. I have a couple of questions to ask you, and then we're going to go ahead and open it up to the participants of the webinar as well for questions. But my first is if you'd be willing to share a little bit specifically the experience of hosting a pilot in the Great Lakes region and what the benefits of that are.
Yeah, I think the Great Lakes region is perfect for what we're trying to do. So LightDeck is based in Boulder, Colorado, and we do get some harmful algae blooms here in the region, but really it's not to the same extent as the Great Lakes region. We would have to travel significantly further, and the actual harmful algae blooms we see here are pretty inconsistent, and oftentimes we're only dealing with one or two different species of cyanobacteria that are generating these blooms. Whereas the Great Lakes region has such a diverse aquatic environment. Within a really small region, we see pockets of many different toxins, and oftentimes we're seeing different cyanotoxin species or cyanobacteria species rising and falling throughout the season. So we're able to monitor and test with different toxins within the same region, different species that are generating the toxins, and really monitor how all of that impacts these toxin levels. And I think it really highlights the challenges of monitoring these harmful algae blooms. And let's see if I can pull this up real quick. I've got a image I'd like to share that I think really kind of shows why this is such a big issue, being able to monitor them very rapidly. So this is my slide showing? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. So this is an image taken from a HAB grab in Lake Erie. I believe this is in 2020, but this is looking at, this is all performed in a single day, monitoring harmful algae blooms across Lake Erie. And you can see that just across Lake Erie, within a single body of water, in very close proximity to each other, you get regions with different levels of toxins. And so being able to both spatially and temporally monitor all of these toxins is really important. And I think Lake Erie and the Great Lakes region is a perfect location for this, just with how complex and diverse the ecosystem is, and the sheer number of partners in the area between Cleveland Water Alliance, the volunteer scientists, all the universities in the area, NOAA being so involved. It makes it just a great opportunity for this type of testing.
Thank you for sharing that. I do want to stress that Lake Erie is a really valuable resource for this kind of testing and other type of testing because we are so shallow. We are the most biodiverse of all of the Great Lakes. And we also are the warmest, which is a unfortunately good environment for algal blooms to become an issue in. I also wanted to ask if you had anything specific you could share that came from the citizen scientists and what the value of working them in particular was.
Yeah, I think working with the citizen scientists is really the ideal group for us to be working with. Obviously, we're very focused on the science, and we want to make sure from a technical perspective that everything is working great. And that's why we have all of our collaborators at these academic universities. But ultimately, the goal of this product is to be put in the hands of everyday users and people that are actually monitoring and managing these water systems. And while a lot of the LightDeck technology is used in veterinary laboratories or point of care for human settings where you're dealing with highly trained professionals in laboratory settings, once you get out into the water, there's a lot less training involved. So we want to make sure that these tests are very easy to use, very straightforward, and not at all complicated and don't break down. And so actually working with these citizen scientists is the ideal group because they're who we want to ultimately have this in the hands of, and getting their feedback allows us to make sure we're tailoring our product towards the group that's going to be using it the most. And as I kind of highlighted earlier on in the presentation, we got those two big, points of emphasis from our 2021 pilot of, this is great in a lab setting, but it's not extremely field portable. And while we are following the proper protocols and going through a freeze thaw lysis process, that's still really inconvenient for us, and it requires us to take samples back to the lab. Those have allowed us to focus on different ways in order to improve the field portability of our testing system and find ways to really try to make this as beneficial for the end user as possible. And it's really easy for us as researchers to just kind of get stuck in the weeds of the technical side of things, or we know how it works in a laboratory setting, but to actually get that feedback from people that would be using it on a regular basis really helps us to tailor this product to what we think is going to be the most beneficial to the most people.
Absolutely. I want to emphasize the value of our citizen scientists and how wonderful that we believe them to be, because it's not just an additional workforce that we can utilize for these pilots. It's a point of view that's really important to the pilot itself, I think, as well. My last question for you, Greg, it should be an easy one. What's up next for LightDeck?
Yeah, so again, been hammering on this all day, but the first thing that's coming up for us is the triplex test with the addition of saxitoxin. Again, we're hoping to get that commercially launched in 2023. And our team has been doing a lot of work on the development of the fourplex, including anatoxin. That's currently in our pipeline, and we're looking at 2024 for that one. We've also been doing a lot of work with the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Committee. Sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful there. Where we've been developing a screening test for shellfish toxins. So I mentioned that a little bit earlier on, but we're actually going through the process working with ISSC to get that approved as a screening test that would be used for farmers that are commercially selling shellfish like mussels. That way they can screen for any marine toxins that might be showing up in their filter feeding shellfish. In addition to that, we are looking at expanding from freshwater testing into marine or saltwater testing. That's something that is currently in our portfolio as well. And then there's the USACE grant that's ongoing, allowing us to look at algal species identification. So that's really important in terms of maybe before we actually start seeing those toxins being generated, if we're able to identify the species of algae that's causing a bloom, we'd be able to predict whether or not there's a likelihood that a toxin is going to be generated and which toxins we could expect to see specifically. And then finally, this is probably one of the biggest ongoing projects we have at LightDeck. It's a little bit out of left field. It's still related to water quality, but it's not related to any of these harmful algae blooms. But we've recently got funding from the USDA in order to develop a test for perfluoroalkylated substances, or PFAS chemicals. Forever chemicals, they've been really big in the news in the past, I'd say, year or two. But the EPA has been really driving on this a lot. And as of right now, there was actually, I think this is about a year old at this point, so these numbers are probably off by a little bit, but there was about 2,900 known contaminated sites in the United States, with over 57,000 presumptive contaminated sites. And this spans all 50 states in the United States. So this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. not just in the Great Lakes region, but all throughout the country. So we're currently trying to develop a quantitative point of care test for looking at a couple different PFAS species as well. And so we're hoping that will give us another arm of our environmental testing to keep working through.
Yeah, unfortunately, at Cleveland Water Alliance, we are intimately familiar with the PFAS issue that we're facing. So I know I will definitely be keeping an eye on that work that you're doing, because it's important and it's burgeoning as one of our primary topics.
Yeah, I get asked about that on a very regular basis.
Yeah. So we do have a couple of questions from the audience that we'd like you to take a whack at answering. So the first one is from Peter Tuitt, it looks like. And what method is used for the cell, this word is a tough one for me, lysis? How long does it take, and how long does it take?
Yeah, so currently we recommend that users actually follow the EPA recommended. I believe it's method 546, but I'd have to double check the actual method number. But it's a freeze thaw methodology. So in that case, the user would take a sample, you put it into a freezer at either a -20 or a -80. You let the sample fully freeze, you let it fully thaw, and you repeat that for 3 full cycles. Depending on the volume of your sample, this can take anywhere between about 20 minutes per cycle up to 30 or even 45 minutes per cycle. So as you can imagine, having to go through that cycle 3 times, that can be pretty time consuming. So you're realistically looking at about 45 minutes to an hour to go through a freeze thaw cycle, the full round of freeze thaw cycling for lysis. As I did mention, LightDeck is in the process of developing a portable field usable lysis system. This relies on heat beating technology, and that would take about 10 minutes. We're still in the prototype stage of this. We're not quite reaching the same levels of efficacy as freeze thaw, but we do have a current improved version of that is being field tested by our collaborators at University of Michigan. So hopefully we get some positive results after their summer sampling, and we'll have some better updates on that going into 2023.
Great. Our next question is from Angel Martin, and it is, are there any biofouling issues that possibly may affect the cartridges, and what can be done to mitigate this possible situation?
Yeah, so the biggest issue we run into is if you have an extremely dense or viscous algal bloom and it's not fully lysed, that can actually clog up the microfluidics of the cartridge. But we see very little actual biofouling of the cartridge themselves. One of the key benefits of the planar waveguide technology that LightDeck utilizes is that with that evanescent field, even if we have other contaminants present in the actual cartridge, we're only getting very localized fluorescence. So we see very little background signaling. So really it comes down to making sure that the sample is not so excessively viscous that you're clogging the cartridge itself.
All right, and we have another question from Peter. What depth are the samples taken at, and can the system collect air samples?
Excuse me. So yeah, our collaborators have been testing sampling at various depths. I don't know the deepest we've actually tested. That's something I'd have to check with the actual people doing the collection. But I believe typically we're looking about 3 to 6 feet below surface level. But we can collect samples directly from the surface. I've personally gone out and collected samples here in Colorado from harmful algal blooms that have arisen. And I'm not going out onto a boat. I'm collecting those directly from the edge of a lake. So as long as you're collecting surface water that contains the toxin, we're able to detect it. Again, when you're collecting directly from the surface, you may have a scummier sample because you're getting more of that algal bloom that's on the surface. and that may require some cell lysis or allowing the sample to sediment a little bit so that you're not drawing up the actual algal or the cyanobacteria into the cartridge. But again, we've not run into any issues with sampling depth. But that's something that would be more specific to our collaborators in the Lake Erie region as to what depths they specifically sample from.
And we have another question from Jerome regarding the STX toxin. And he would like to know how long it takes for this toxin to deteriorate in the body of water over time.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Saxitoxin is definitely less stable than the microcystin or cylindrospermopsin. So a lot of it's going to depend on your environmental conditions, the temperature of the water, if there's any other algal species present, or the amount of light that is actually getting in there. So the density of your algal bloom is going to impact the stability of saxitoxin. But when you're actually looking at it in the field, you're not expecting it to stick around for days at a time. I would say that the half-life of it is going to be within a couple of day period of time. When we're collecting the samples, however, once you've frozen those samples for long-term storage, we've seen that the saxitoxin is quite stable. We have samples that we've stored for months at a time and are able to get reproducible results. So yeah, there's definitely only a short half-life relative to microcystin and cylindrospermopsin for saxitoxin. But again, when you're sampling it and monitoring it, we are able to store and maintain samples for longer periods of time.
All right, it looks like that was the last of our questions. So thank you so much, Greg, for participating in today's Innovator Showcase. This was a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot. Hopefully, if you have any questions for LightDeck, you grabbed Greg's email address at the end of his presentation. And if you have any questions for CWA or are interested in having a trial in the Great Lakes region, you can reach out to me. And as a reminder, this recording will be made available to all those who registered today. So I think we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, which is fine. Everybody gets like 10 minutes of their day back, and have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.